The scent of old paper was the only inheritance Maya had left, and she was breathing it in like the last pocket of air in a sinking ship. It was a complex fragrance, not of decay, but of life lived between pages. The sweet, dusty perfume of aging vanilla linen from the pulp, the sharp, acidic tang of ink, and the faint, earthy aroma of Seattle rain carried in on 1,000 customers' coats. This scent was the soul of the Paperback Sea, the small, fiercely independent bookstore her parents had poured their hearts and their meager savings into, creating a haven of quiet rebellion against a world of glowing screens. Now, at 27, it was her sanctuary and her prison. The comforting scent of stories was now perpetually undercut by the sterile, sharp smell of legal documents arriving in menacingly official envelopes. The latest, a crimson-red final demand letter from Cascade Bank, sat on the counter. Its bold letters a declaration of war she had no army to fight. The store, her childhood home, her entire identity, was being swallowed by a tide of debt she could no longer hold back. Every jingle of the brass bell above the door was a spike of pure adrenaline, the hope for a customer now eclipsed by the terror of a foreclosure agent coming to seal the doors on her parents' legacy. The proposal was not a fantasy whispered over a candlelit dinner. It was a clinical transaction conducted under the cold, blue-white glare of LED panels in an office that seemed to float in the clouds above Seattle. Julian Croft did not look like a man who needed a wife. He looked like a man who had systematically engineered his life to need nothing and no one. He was young, perhaps 30, with the intense, unnervingly intelligent eyes of a master chess player, though they seemed more comfortable scanning lines of code than a human face. He was a ghost in the machine of the corporate world, a reclusive software prodigy who had inherited the colossal, old-world Croft shipping empire, a legacy he wore like a suit of armor, heavy and constricting. He didn't meet Maya's eyes as she sat opposite him across a desk of polished obsidian that seemed to stretch for miles. His gaze was fixed on a point somewhere over her shoulder, as if he were debugging the awkward human interaction in real time. He laid out the situation with the dispassionate logic of a software patch note. His late father, a titan of industry who valued tradition and public perception above all, had embedded a non-negotiable clause in his last will and testament. To assume full, unrestricted control of the company's board and voting shares, Julian had to be legally married and cohabitating in a stable domestic partnership for a period of no less than 1 calendar year before his 31st birthday. That birthday was 13 months away. He explained it not as a personal dilemma, but as a critical bug in his life's operating system, a frustrating piece of legacy code that needed a workaround. He had a problem that required a variable he didn't possess. Through a long, improbable chain of legal connections, initiated by Maya's own desperate consultation with a pro bono law clinic about bankruptcy options, he had learned that she, too, had a problem. He offered a logical, ruthlessly efficient patch for both their bugs. A 1-year, legally binding marriage contract. In exchange for her performing the role of Mrs. Julian Croft at approximately a dozen necessary board meetings and charity galas, he would execute a single wire transfer that would not just pay off the bookstore's entire debt, but also provide it with a modest operating fund for the next 5 years. It wouldn't be a loan. It would be a fee. A payment for a service rendered. The leather-bound folder containing the contract felt heavier than any book Maya had ever held. It was a deal with a devil who didn't even have the decency to be charming. A devil who saw the world in binary and had just presented her with a terrible logical equation. She spent a long, sleepless night in her small apartment above the bookstore, the city lights of Seattle casting long, distorted shadows on the walls that looked like prison bars. She could hear the faint, distant horn of a ferry on Puget Sound, a mournful sound that echoed her own profound loneliness. This felt like selling her soul. She called her older brother David, his voice a world away in Portland, crackling with concern. When she explained the offer, his reaction was immediate and visceral. "Absolutely not, Maya. This is insane. You're not selling a bookstore. You're selling a year of your life. You're selling yourself. Dad would be turning in his grave." "Dad would want the store to survive," she shot back, her voice cracking. "This is their legacy. It's all I have left of them. What am I supposed to do? Just let a bank turn it into a vape shop or another soulless coffee chain?" The argument was circular and painful. He saw the violation of her spirit. She saw the desecration of their parents' memory. At dawn, with eyes gritty from crying and exhaustion, she looked at the contract again. The non-disclosure agreement was a chapter in itself, a terrifying document that bound her to absolute silence about Julian Croft's personal and professional life, forever. It was a gag order on her own story. But then she looked down through the floorboards, imagining the rows of silent books below, each one a memory, each one a promise her parents had made to the community. To let them be boxed up and sold off by the pound felt like a betrayal far greater than a temporary, loveless marriage. The signing took place the next day in the same sterile lawyer's office. The pen felt cold and heavy in her hand. Her signature on the thick parchment was neat and steady, a final act of defiance against the chaos that threatened to consume her. Moments after she signed, her phone buzzed. It was a notification from her bank. A deposit had been made. The number was so large it seemed fictional. The relief was so immense it made her feel sick. Julian Croft's penthouse was a cathedral of glass and steel, a silent minimalist palace suspended so high above the city that the world below seemed like a simulation. The view was breathtaking, a panoramic sweep of Puget Sound, the jagged peaks of the Olympic Mountains, and the glittering, rain-slicked grid of the city. But it was the cold, impersonal beauty of a photograph, not a home. The furniture was sculptural, the art was abstract, and the silence was absolute, broken only by the faint hum of the climate control system. When her few, worn-out moving boxes arrived, delivered by men in discreet uniforms, they looked like relics from another civilization, artifacts of a warmth and a history this place had never known. Julian gave her a brief, awkward tour, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his perfectly tailored trousers. "This will be your wing," he said, indicating a suite of rooms that was larger than her entire bookstore. "My private quarters and office are on the other side. The kitchen and living area are communal." He said the word communal as if it were a technical term for a shared server, a space of function, not comfort. Her first night was a study in profound isolation. She tried to read, but the silence was too loud. She stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the ferries glide across the dark water like lonely stars, and felt an ache of dislocation so sharp it was a physical pain. She was the ghost in his perfect, empty machine. Their first performance was the annual Croft Shipping Foundation Gala, a glittering affair filled with the city's most powerful and influential people. The preparation was an exercise in erasure. A styling team, dispatched by Julian's unseen and hyper-efficient assistant, descended upon the penthouse. They were polite, professional, and treated Maya like a beautiful, inanimate object to be decorated. They plucked, painted, and sculpted her into a version of herself she did not recognize. The silk gown they chose was the color of a stormy sea, a beautiful but melancholy armor that felt both priceless and worthless. When she finally looked in the mirror, she saw a stranger with her own eyes. Before they left, Julian briefed her in the living area, his voice clipped and precise, as if outlining a business strategy. He gave her a tablet with a seating chart and a dossier on the keyboard members. "Stick to neutral topics. Art, literature, your area of expertise. The weather," he instructed. "If anyone asks how we met, it was through a mutual acquaintance at the Fry Art Museum. We bonded over a shared appreciation for post-war modernism. Keep it simple. Less data means fewer bugs." At the gala, she played her part. She smiled until her face ached. She touched his arm at the pre-approved intervals. She recited the lines she had rehearsed. But beneath the surface of the polite chatter, she felt like she was suffocating. Then, during a particularly crowded moment near the orchestra, a boisterous guest, laughing too loudly, stumbled backward and jostled Julian, spilling champagne on his tuxedo. For a split second, before his mask of cold composure slammed back into place, Maya saw it, a flash of raw, unadulterated panic in his eyes. He flinched, a barely perceptible recoil from the unexpected physical contact. It wasn't anger or annoyance. It was fear. It was the terrified look of a man drowning, not in water, but in the simple, messy, unpredictable proximity of other people. And in that fleeting moment, she saw him not as her client, her benefactor, or a cold-hearted millionaire. She saw a fellow prisoner, trapped in a different kind of cage, just as gilded and just as lonely as her own. Driven by a strange new curiosity and a desperate need for something authentic in the sterile expanse of the penthouse, Maya began to search. The glimpse of vulnerability she had seen in Julian at the gala was a crack in a marble facade, and she found herself wanting to know what lay beneath. For days, she explored the apartment not as a resident, but as an archaeologist, looking for a trace of the real Julian Croft. She ran her hands over the cold, impersonal sculptures, the perfectly arranged art books on the coffee table that looked as if they'd never been opened. It was a home designed to be looked at, not lived in. Then, one rainy afternoon, she noticed it. In the long, stark white hallway that connected her wing to his, one wall panel didn't quite align with the others. It was a subtle imperfection in a world of flawless design. It had no handle, but when she pressed it, there was a soft click, and the panel swung inward, revealing not a closet, but a door. The air that wafted out was completely different from the rest of the penthouse. It smelled of old paper, ozone from aging electronics, and the faint, sweet scent of wood glue. It smelled like a life. The room inside was a glorious, breathtaking mess. It was Julian's secret heart. Bookshelves overflowed with worn science fiction paperbacks from the Golden Age: Asimov, Clarke, Heinlein, and Philip K. Dick. Stacks of old computer manuals and engineering textbooks formed precarious towers on the floor. One wall was a massive whiteboard covered in complex algorithms and cryptic notes, and in the center of it all was a large workbench, cluttered with the delicate skeletons of half-finished projects. A vintage radio being restored, a complex clockwork model of a solar system, and intricate schematics for machines that seemed to belong in the very sci-fi novels that surrounded them. It was the room of a boy who had never stopped wanting to build new worlds. A boy trapped inside the man who had been forced to run this one. It was the most beautiful room Maya had ever seen. On an impulse, she went back to her own room, to one of her few boxes from the bookstore. She pulled out a well-loved copy of Ursula K. Le Guin's The Dispossessed, a story of two worlds, of walls, of a man trying to bridge an impossible divide. She returned to the library and placed the book on the corner of his workbench, a quiet offering left in the heart of his hidden world. 2 days passed in silence. Maya worried she had overstepped, a trespasser who had violated the one sacred space in their transactional arrangement. On the third evening, Julian sought her out. He didn't knock on her door. She found him standing in the vast, dark living room, the city lights glittering behind him like a distant galaxy. He was holding her book. His expression was not angry, but guarded, unreadable. "You were in my library," he stated. It wasn't an accusation, just a fact. "It's the only room in this entire apartment that looks like a person actually lives in it," she replied softly, her heart beating a little faster. He didn't respond, his thumb tracing the worn cover of the novel. "I've been looking for a first edition of this for years," he said, his voice quiet. "The central theme, the anarchist society on Anaris, their struggle with property and possession." He trailed off, looking at her properly for the first time. "You understand." It was a moment of profound, unexpected connection. They talked for hours. He spoke of his love for science fiction, not as an escape, but as a way to explore systems, societies, and the flaws in their design. It was the same analytical brilliance he applied to code, but directed at humanity. She spoke of her love for literature, for the way stories could build bridges of empathy between people, allowing them to live outside of their own limited experiences. For the first time, he revealed a piece of his past. He told her about the plane crash that had killed his parents when he was 19, a tragedy that had thrust him into the head of a corporate empire he never wanted, and made him terrified of the chaotic, unpredictable nature of the world outside his own controlled environments. "Code is logical," he said, staring out at the city. "Variables can be controlled. People are messy." The conversation did not magically make them friends, but it built a bridge across the vast, silent space between their two wings of the penthouse. It was the beginning of a new clause in their unwritten contract. The lines began to blur. The sterile, businesslike arrangement started to accumulate the messy, unpredictable data of human connection. They started having dinner together once a week, initially under the pretense of better coordinating their public appearances. But the corporate jargon quickly fell away, replaced by debates about books and discussions about their days. One afternoon, Maya came down with a sudden aggressive flu. She was dizzy and weak, completely miserable in her luxurious but sterile bedroom. She expected to be left alone, to have food delivered by a silent assistant. Instead, Julian appeared at her door, looking deeply awkward and out of his element. He didn't come in, but an hour later, a tray appeared outside her room with a bowl of soup, a pot of tea, and a bottle of the exact cold medicine she needed. Later, she found out he had spent half an hour on the phone, clumsily describing her symptoms to his doctor to ensure he got the right thing. It was an act of kindness so uncharacteristic and so inefficient that it felt more intimate than any grand gesture. Their next public appearance was a fundraiser at the Seattle Art Museum. This time, there was no clumsy rehearsal. In the car on the way there, they didn't review names. They talked about the new author she was stocking at the store. At the event, they moved as a team. When a pushy journalist tried to corner Julian about a recent corporate merger, Maya smoothly interjected, drawing the journalist into a conversation about the art exhibit, a topic she could navigate with effortless grace. Later, when she saw Julian cornered by a large, boisterous group, his face growing pale with anxiety, she calmly walked over, touched his arm, and whispered, "The CEO of an energy company is asking my opinion on expressionism. I need your support." She led him away from the crowd, giving him the space to breathe. He gave her a look of silent, profound gratitude. They were no longer just actors playing a part. They had become partners, each watching out for the other's vulnerabilities. The pretense was starting to feel more real than their solitary lives had ever been. The final gala was a bittersweet performance. It was their last required public appearance before the one-year contract expired. They moved through the glittering ballroom with the flawless grace of a couple who had been together for years. Their smiles were genuine, their private jokes whispered behind champagne flutes were real. They were performing the role of a perfect couple, and the most terrifying part was that it required almost no acting at all. The melancholy came from the knowledge that this beautiful illusion was just days away from its scheduled termination. The event required them to participate in the ceremonial first dance. As Julian led her to the dance floor, Maya's heart hammered in her chest. It was the first time they would have such close, prolonged physical contact. He was clumsy at first, his movements as logical and stiff as his conversations. "I don't do this," he murmured, his voice low. "Just follow my lead," she whispered back. She relaxed in his arms, guiding him through the simple steps, and slowly, he began to move with her. In the silence between them, with the orchestra swelling around them, they weren't the millionaire and his contract wife. They were just Julian and Maya. The world of contracts and obligations fell away, and all that was left was the simple, terrifying truth of two lonely people holding on to each other. Later that night, back in the silent penthouse that now felt like a home, the weight of the impending end was unbearable. Julian stood before her, the city lights creating a fractured halo around him. "The contract," he began, his voice formal, stilted. "It's fulfilled. My lawyers will handle the final transfer of the bookstore deed tomorrow. You have performed your duties in an exemplary manner." He was retreating back into the safety of business language. Maya simply nodded, her throat too tight to speak. "It was a transaction," she managed to whisper. He looked at her, his composure finally breaking. "It was," he said, his voice cracking. "But this apartment was just a set of coordinates before you came. A place. Now, it feels different. I feel different. I know this wasn't part of the agreement, Maya. I know you're free. But I am asking, please, don't go." The contract was over. Maya awoke the next morning in a world that had fundamentally shifted. She was, for the first time in a year, completely free. The debt was gone. Her obligation was fulfilled. The power dynamic had been inverted. She held all the cards. She could walk out the door and never look back, and he would have no legal right to stop her. She spent the day in a daze, torn between the life she had reclaimed and the man she had unexpectedly found. The next day, she returned to the paperback sea. The debt-paid stamp on the new deed was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. The store was quiet, hers again. She spent the day breathing in the scent of paper, running her hands over the spines of books, reclaiming her own identity, piece by piece. She needed to know she could stand on her own 2 feet again, in her own world, before she could decide if she wanted to let his world in. Late that afternoon, the bell above the door jingled. Julian stood there, looking more nervous and out of place than he ever had at a gala. He wasn't wearing a suit, but a simple sweater. In his hand, he held the worn-out copy of The Dispossessed. He walked to the counter. "I finished it," he said softly. "I was wondering if the owner of this store might have a recommendation for what I should read next. Maybe we could discuss it. Over coffee?" Maya looked at him. Not the millionaire, not the client, but Julian, the boy from the secret library. She looked around at her world, saved and whole again. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she gave a smile that was completely, unequivocally her own. The contract was over. Their real story, in a chapter they would have to write together, was just beginning.